Hello everyone, today we talk about the Ottonian Restauratio Imperii in the 10th century. This is definitely not a new topic on Schwerpunkt, however I used to talk about this chapter of high medieval history in Schwerpunkt's earlier days, and just in a very introductory fashion. It's of course an evergreen, we could make so many videos about this, but I have in store this is not prepared, but it would be very easy to do so. A video about the role of the Germans as a nation in the Renovatio Imperii, in a say traditional perspective, that would clarify lots of things. In fact, partly also about the ones that we'll be discussing today. Of course, revolving around the most authentic meaning of the empire. I made a pertinent video that you could watch, albeit being like relatively old, about the passage from the Imperium Francorum to the Imperium Romanum Christianum occurring in Ottonian times. Today we will mostly emphasize the continuity between the Frankish and the Saxon empires, that was actually the same empire, and other aspects concerning especially the relation with the papacy, right? But this Renovatio means not much for, say, much of the future, the following centuries, but for how it was thought of, like, at the times by the same, say, the most directly involved figures, namely Otto I, his biographer Widukind, the Pope John XII, and as we will see, others. Now, the last Charlemagne's direct descendant, speaking female line, to wear imperial crown was Berengar of Friuli. Right, we talked about him in the video about Friuli. We'll actually have to make a video about him specifically. Berengar reigned as king in Italy from 888 to 924, and he was proclaimed emperor by Pope John X in 950. Right, we still have to look at the Italic nobility during especially the first half of the 10th century, the end of the 9th, because these people had close at hand geographically the Roman imperial title, right? They could simply march on Rome and having themselves crowned by the Pope. It wasn't that simple. The main problem of these rulers is that their power extended to just a provincial level, like actually most post-Carolingian, not all post-Carolingian rulers at this specific time. That's why, of course, what Otto I achieved, and especially in securing the Eastern Frankish kingdom, plus the Burgundian one, with the Italic one that had preserved institutionally, like this role of, say, this central role in the conferment of the imperial crown, because without the Iron One of Pavia you couldn't really do so, be the foundation of, in fact, a newly, say, a renewed universal power. And this, of course, as you know, has enormous implications throughout all the later history, but it began at this point. And it's interesting to see how, in this, of course, difficult time of the so-called Iron Century, the rulers had to essentially, in fact, establish a new regime that was seen as foundational for the future developments, and that had to be based on very precise theological, traditional, political implications. There is another underrated aspect about what had happened before Otto I came to Italy in a broader sense. That is to say, the rise to power in Rome of the comital dynasty of Theophylact, right? And this had brought with itself already from the 9th century the tradition of providing imperial protection over the Holy See facing a bleak future. The entire point of the empire was the protection that the rulers could exert on the Roman people that was still seen as the actual holders, the bestowers of imperial power, right? In imperial crowning in Rome, the Roman people had to acclaim the newly crowned, in fact, not already emperor in that up to that very moment, in order for him to be recognized as such, officially, formally, internationally. There is a centrality of Rome, of Romanity, in its central metaphysical absolute, right, in the history of mankind, that people studying this, say, time in history do not properly realize, traditionally wise. This is not an exaggeration or an hyperbole, right? The people at the time believed this about Rome. This is what Rome had been. It had not been just like one place that we see creating an empire that we color in red on maps where, there were other peoples that were sort of a different thing. Rome was seen unequivocally as the only center of the universe, right? There was not any other vision, not even the Holy Land was really seen in this Catholic perspective. That doesn't necessarily mean Christian, but had, of course, become Christian by this point. So important as the holy city of Rome, right? And this is such a strong of a reason that even at the bottom, let's say, of public imperial authority in Europe, like at this point, the sense that the empire had to be restored, that only he who at this point was crowned by the Pope in Rome, because without Rome there is no God meaning as the absolute God that has always existed. And this was preserved. Like, you could think, this is what I always say about the history of civilization, and especially its etymologically correct and traditionally meaningful definition of Catholicism, that you could think, well, in fact, as the perspective we were saying before, end of the Roman Empire, what's the need of Rome, right? This is what the average 2024 person, if we can use this substantive to describe them, actually believes. Like, we're talking about real people, right? Look around you. Like, real people would think this. And so it's over, right? And who cares about Romanity? Who cares about Rome? Who cares about this whole thing? And yes, now that we are at it, let's also come back to paganism that didn't even exist, technically, at least in the way we in fact, at least the average person still believes that actually happened in the history of religions. And let's simply go on in a different way, like 19th century nation states after 1,000 years of history in which maybe something happened that before had not happened, and that of course was not a good thing at all for, again, the average person, if we can so call them that way again, would actually believe. The system lasted. Right, this system was immediately identified since Liutprand. It's not even to be given for granted, because civilization can fall, can collapse, right, in a much more disastrous way than it did throughout history, and especially denaturated of that truly Catholic belief. This was not the case. Since Liutprand, it was now established that whoever wanted to be recognized as emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, could not but pass through Rome. I say Holy Roman Emperor like in the, say, formal diciture, as we will see now, was not yet come around, but I stress the holiness, of course, like how holy, Catholic, apostolic, we tend to forget this specific, this is a messenger of the Nike, of divine glory, of course, containing Imperium, and Roman Emperor, right? the metaphysical absolute of the Roman ethnicity of the empire was something that nobody could simply do without, right? Especially when there was an actually Roman people, right? Europe was, of course, on the wall, like understood still between, of course, the Romans in some sense. Of course, this is actually narrower when talking about the papacy in Rome and what we think these really meant, because as you know, that Rome had also quite emancipated itself, to say the least, and from the Byzantine Empire. At this point, it is fundamentally within a Frankish world. The same Byzantines actually were quite adamant about having lost Rome in that sense, that broader sense, spiritual and universal. And of course, there were the Germans, were peoples that were not Roman, but that could not be recognized as emperors by themselves, and needed to be appointed by the Pope and the Roman people as such, right? Because the only way to demonstrate to the world that you were able to protect the Romans in their in perennial, right, place in the firmament of heroes as a genus, even if the empire had collapsed and of course those people were gone, right, but was seen as the only way to reverse, of course, the fall of the world. And something that the Germans, by the way, were extremely sensitive to, just by the fact that as a more primitive people were much closer, in a sense, to that sense of warlikeness, and as we'll see, not completely to the actually traditional point of it all, but to that impending sense of the twilight of the gods, of the rotten nature of the lower, let's say, of the roots of the world, and the necessity of preparing and living in life as in death, as warriors for the waiting for the age of the wolf, the attack on the Asgard, and God knows at that point what would have actually happened. And they felt responsible for the Romans equally, because they understood, to a very high level of pride, that of course that divine favor that would bestow on them the earned imperium, now of course came with the burden of protecting Romanity. And of course, like the most obvious evidence of the radically advanced civilization that Southern Europe and Italy in particular had maintained compared to the rest of the continent. And that was also the only place from which any universal empire could ever reborn, right? And that's why the Ottonians were incredibly, involved in this, like basically all the other Germanic emperors that could afford to have enough power to direct to the Mediterranean. It would be directed to the Mediterranean. There was no other way around that. And I think as Europeans, as Westerners, the fact that we basically don't think about this every day, as much as you see, the meme about thinking about the Roman Empire every day. But yes, what happened to the Roman Empire? That's the part that has been removed from your brain surgically by 19th century nationalist and or socialist that is to say leftistic fourth estate lesser people ideology that you actually believe is for actually definable human beings. And what happened in the Middle Ages is instead the actual and heroically desperate effort of these peoples to maintain that, right, to maintain the ideal, to resist evil, to not to make, let's say, the sense of sacred disappearing and falling, fading in the heart of man. And this is something you may want to reflect on in general. But aside from this, and coming back on point briefly, like the idea that the possibility of someone protecting the Holy See was possible, in spite of the fact, again, that Rome had been essentially, we can't say hijacked, because the thing had always worked like this, but let's say had been properly in the papal power, in the ecclesiastical element, protected, dominated by the powerful Roman clan of the Theophylacts, that were, by the way, very prejudicial. I made lots of videos about Rome during the period, not lots, but some significant ones, where Rome under Charles III, for example, So we're looking at a situation which we realize that the Roman baronial families are definitely incredibly self-aware of their international role. An international role that Rome had. Here, let's not even talk about the process of Christianization. It was relentlessly succeeding across Europe, and that in fact the same Ottonians would also bolster further thanks to their imperial achievement. It's also something we will see somewhere else, right? But the idea that somebody in arms, right, could, just think about Charlemagne, that had left that legacy also in terms of, look at what the hell of a huge empire had been created, could simply re-achieve this dream of the northern conquerors, representating the age of order in a more sensual and, warm south, in this tempered center of the world that Rome was, and from which a new genus of heroes had to spring back again. It surely excited the fantasies of the same German leaders that at this point were, in fact, thinking very seriously about that. Right? What does Otto do when the problems in Germany are over? Right? That's always the same thing. Now, the Western Frankish kings at this point, and you know that because I answered also some questions that you sent me about it, were too preoccupied with dynastic rivalries and internal political fragmentation. Right? There is a reason, complex reason, for which actually the most powerful, the biggest in terms of military potential of the post-Carolingian kingdoms, that is the Western Frankish one, was not intervening in Italy after Charles the Second, who went to Italy, almost risked to have a bigger bath of blood against the Eastern Franks in the north, and they contracted for his imperial crown, but for him to go back to Western France. All right. It may seem a paradox, but it has to do with the gluing capacity that, after all, so that heavily decentralized vassalitic beneficiary system effect had in France, right, where the local vassals were so individually powerful that it could paralyze the emergence of a monarchy. Was in this sense, for the entire resources involved, way more ahead, say, than the Eastern Frankish kingdom, that, however, had a different balance. It could provide that sort of power, that green light, to a single ruler that barely controlled even a half of the country, but that exactly for this reason could float right over countries like, in fact, Germany, Italy, Burgundy, etc., and getting a little bit from everywhere and still maintain this grandiose capacity, say imperial office in a universal sense. So the new Saxon dynasty in East Francia, and we'll talk more surely about the rise of the Ottonians, Henry the Fabulous reign, etc. I made some videos, if anything, about some of their military expeditions that can give you an idea of how they spent their entire lives fundamentally. On horseback, hammering down the Slavs or fighting a bit under the Western Franks. They had fun, right? There is no doubt. The Magyars being their main target, telling the truth, and so adding to the exotic, roster of enemies that they could, in fact, test their own imperial worthiness against. And that, in fact, was drawing much of this prestige exactly from the incredibly brutally violent Magyar and Slavic wars that was all an issue in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, because these enemies did concretely risk to destabilize to the point of crumbling the eastern part of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, the same Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria. Made multiple videos about this, were heavily ravaged by these incursions, and as much as it was technically their fault, as when they change idea, things regarding the leniency at least, the necessity, the preferability of the lack of a central leader, right? And with the option of decentralizing, also thanks to these raids, we're letting them this whole thing happen. And for a long time, as a consequence, we look at the west, at the east of the Frankish world, no ruler was really likely to interfere in Italian politics in a manner that Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, but also Lothair the First, that ended up, as you know, like shifting the imperial dynasty into Italy, into the Italic kingdom, could do, right? And yet, in fact, the assumption that nobody could really do it again, which was an enormous issue, right? As I said before, in a universal perspective, in terms of Catholic duty, and just even in terms of concrete power, because that's what the Imperium and divine grace really substantiated itself of, like, would offer the opportunity of doing, was too great, was too inviting, too obvious, right? Too archetypal, too traditional to let go. Otto the Great inaugurated the German imperial age in 962, based on the Carolingian tradition, and this era would continue in various forms, as you know, until the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire, of the German nation during the Napoleonic secularization of 1806. And it's been historiographically noticed, just like by, for example, like it's an old author, but Percy Ernst Schramm did it, among others, that say the powerful myth proclaiming the city of Rome as the head of the world would not diminish at all, simply because the neo-Roman emperors of the period from 800 to 924 ultimately failed to establish a lasting political link between Rome and Francia, right? This was impossible, right? The world had not degenerated that much. The Catholic doctrine was too, say, macroscopically universal to, like, detach Rome, of course, from its millenary accomplishment of world centrality. Even, of course, this is beyond time, according to tradition, strictly meant. If you look at all the theology behind the temple of Janus, for example. In any case, the question remains, essentially, when did Otto I of Eastern Francia crystallize his ambition to elevate himself to the status of emperor, right? And how did it really come about? Like, yes, we've just said it. This concept existed. Everybody wanted to come back to it, but let's say by which degree? Like, he thought that this had been could be accomplished, and how could simply, like, the institutional continuity with especially the Frankish Empire could be carried out, on which basis, and say not simply the one. Yes, he was a powerful ruler that, however, was not, for example, as powerful as Charlemagne, and that in turn was not as powerful as the Roman emperors back in the day. So, in a strictly historical sense, in many cases, especially at this point, like, we do not have a precisely documentable answer, right? When you look at the primary sources, there is something really jarring about this choice, even, of the king's political drive toward the imperial status, or at least of its Romanity to an extent. For example, the Bishop Liutprand of Cremona, in his Liber de Ottone Reges, so the book about the King Otto, presents the imperial coronation of 962 essentially as the culmination of a rescue package for the Italian kingdom in general, right? And for the papacy in particular, right? Liutprand was actually very faithful to the Ottonians. So this is what makes it all interesting. You know that this was a guy that, of course, was essentially an Italian, right? He spoke Romance. He was from Lombardy, but in this sense, he thought of himself as a German, in virtue of the fact that he was a Longobard, and of course, that was essentially a Longobard kingdom there that, as you know, had being posed by the same Charlemagne at the same level, constitutionally, in the empire of the Frankish one, which didn't happen with any other part of the empire, and attached to which, even beyond that, right, the Frankish kingdom was not attached with any imperial authority. The Italic kingdom was, right, at least in order to be crowned in Rome, you had to, before, like, you couldn't get around Lombardy and say, okay, well, that's not, of course, that was also not strategically feasible for a Central European power, granted, but it was not, it was properly sanctioned, as we've seen from Louis the Pius times, to be necessary, propedeutic. It was the first step from whichever Francia you came from, like at this point, and this would continue also through the modern age. Like in theory, also a French ruler would compete, right, for the Holy Roman Imperial crown. There was nothing specifically, say, narrowly Eastern Frankish about that. In order to obtain the imperial crown in Rome, again by the Pope and the Roman people. I can't stress enough how dependent on the latter this actually was. So, in this respect, when you look at Liutprand's account, you can't unsee in his interpretation of what Otto did in 962 the continuity with Charlemagne. Right? This was basically the same thing. It's as if Liutprand had been describing Charlemagne invading Italy, conquering the Longobards in 774, and the following coronation of Christmas of 800. Naturally, this had happened in a much shorter time frame because, and this sort of even flattered Otto in the narrative, of course, of the story. Given that, of course, the thing had happened just in a couple of years. Otto had conquered Lombardy in 961, and his Roman coronation had occurred the year after. Now, the problem with this is that what was thought of Otto south of the Alps, and not necessarily in the base of this watershed, was not the same that was thought of him north of the Alps, right? And especially you have Widukind of Corvey, that is, as you know, Otto's biographer. And so, by the way, like, of course, the most important source basically about him, this guy was a Saxon, right, offering a markedly different interpretation of Otto the Great's rights as an emperor, right? And this is extremely interesting because it really, say, allows us to understand a bit like the mentality of these peoples and how they would think differently what was going on for them. Of course, there were deep politically contingent issues going on, including what would actually happen later. That is to say, as we pointed out, that literally the Ottonians transferred their court on the Palatine Hill. Right, and this means that in this general plan, Germany should have become some sort of decentralized province, as opposed to, the seat of those rulers. That, by the way, had started to literally call themselves Romans, also in an ethnical point of view. And this Widukind could not stand. Really made another video about this, which I don't remember if you go into the Ottonian playlist. It's one of this one I mentioned. About the passage from the Imperium Francorum to the Romanum Christianum, but another is also about the Byzantine influence on the Ottonian Germanic imperial tradition, symbology, that is really worth considering in the bigger scheme, also because the Germans will actually call themselves Romans, at least in that imperial, say, sense, like the rulers would do so, but in that sense also, say, the knights, those who were under these rulers, would themselves identify with Rome. And we find it very late in time. My favorite example is one I know well from the Battle of Markfeld, that is literally like the German war cry was "Here's Rome" in front of the Bohemians. And the degree by which, of course, the German pride at some point like monopolized Romanity was seen as also like an issue. There were other people saying that, say, towards the 12th, 13th century, said, but why did this happen? Like, why do the Germans think that? Also, especially considering that, of course, like the empire was a universal authority, it was at least in line of principle still considered as such in political practice, but that, of course, was not institutionally recognized. On the contrary, the Holy Roman Empire had specific boundaries. It was not controlling, say, the entire Western Christendom even. Now, that's another issue, but as you know, I say you must obviously contextualize it, but it's not that the traditional meaning comes less, right? It's not like that. The scoundrel of Voltaire can really make too many jokes about, especially considering his anti-Catholic betrayal, hypocrisy in many ways. But that's how people have mostly gone with, because let's be honest, like the history of Central Europe, just like the history of Southern Europe, is grossly skipped, like in the more conventional, what has sadly become, in a narrower sense, that what we understand like the conventional pack of Western culture that should be actually much more truly, at least European in scale, in order to fully understand what Western means. Now, what was the issue with Widukind? He first of all puts on the floor this concept, the classical notion, actually, the very migration era, Romano-Germanic one, that the army creates the emperor, a bit just like the Roman people would actually acclaim the emperor in Rome. Of course, we don't have to think about Roman people as the shoemakers. Those were the actual aristocrats. It were people that bore arms themselves. So that was incredibly important in the bigger picture. Because here it's specifically the army. This is almost like a very migration era sense of like every king, every ruler is literally elected by the assembly of the people in arms and erected over the shields, right, and carried, like elevated in that sense towards God, right? So Widukind, by this extent, was saying that the Saxon people, especially, were sort of worthier, in at least the Ottonian power was dependent on the people, and their people, their Saxon people specifically, and that this was therefore like a double thread, indissoluble double thread, that could not essentially shift the merit of the Ottonians, also of Saxon stock, from their own, the same Germanic genus, and that therefore could not simply draw their own legitimization from somewhere. That would be specifically Romanity. As we will see, that's the issue. Like, Widukind did not want to accept that these were Roman emperors. He did not want to accept the idea that it was a sort of an overarching metaphysical ethnos that surpassed his own in the history of mankind, and that, in a sense, the Germans here would have simply, like, either washed it and or reaffirmed it in almost national sense over the rest of the world to that metaphysical level. As we were saying before, of course, this could be done because, of course, the Germans here controlled other peoples, as we've seen, the Longobards, the Burgundians, etc. And they, therefore, they weren't just like their own, even just Eastern Franks, right? And even more like within the same Eastern Franks, as you know, let's say the various peoples, the various stem duchies were barely sort of agglutinated historically in a sense of, say, Teutonic nationhood that had been just sort of fabricated just from the last centuries, mostly in an ecclesiastical, monastic context. And that's why Widukind, by the way, is so proud about his specifically Saxon character, right, as much as the one of his emperor. Widukind's sincere commitment to this explanation is evident also in his account of Henry the Fowler's triumph over the Magyars at Reade in 933. This was actually a much bigger deal of a clash than is often credited for. Like, in other words, Otto I had a mega amplified, historiography and propaganda to bring Lechfeld on the fore, right? The Bavarians did fight a lot and for much longer, in that sense, with greater success in wearing out the Magyars than, say, that their Saxon cousins had done. But, of course, it was the sense of pride and memory of stock, right, of rulers. Always remember that Henry the Fowler had been born when the last Carolingians were still reigning. Think about how, in this sense, continuous the sense of power really was, and how relevant for a Saxon that literally up to some generations before would have had basically nothing to do with the Franks, with Christianity, with the empire, now would have to reflect on being literally at the head of that, and for which connection with God and arms, which is definitely very interesting. And in this instance, Widukind, speaking of Reade, he asserts that the army, after the battle, after the victory over the Hungars, subsequently proclaimed Henry as, quote, because this is obviously in Latin, Pater Patriae Rerum Dominus Imperatorque, right? So, father of his country, father of the fatherland, lord of all things, really, and emperor, right? So there was a sense here that there was actually an imperial authority already manifesting metaphysically in Henry's and so Otto's stock. That isn't, as you understand here, even characterized necessarily in an ethnic sense. This is important because, of course, also Eastern Francia was becoming a dynastic land more than, say, a land of peoples just per se. After his victory at the river Lech in 955, Widukind attributed the titles, or the same titles of Pater, Patria, and Emperor to Otto I, right? Recognizing his as the victor, and so a repetition, a confirmation what his father, his Janus, had already accomplished. Widukind subsequently refers to Otto as emperor, even though the Roman coronation would not occur, in fact, for another 6.5 years. This means, of course, that imperial power, as we've seen, was beyond Romanity. That it did not depend on the papacy, on the Roman people, but it was something that in front of God, to some extent, even though this was just regional fundamentally for Germany, it was a big deal, right? It's not to say that it wasn't important or that it wasn't a massive display of power. Still, however, was considered at the parity of the Carolingian and the Roman rulers. What is even more clamorous, however, about Widukind's psychology about the wall is that he doesn't even mention the Roman crowning of Otto I. Literally, right? He basically, in his history, you would think that, again, like the invasion and conquest of Italy would have been like a huge deal, and in that sense, and you see how, okay, well, the comment later, like, you know, you would think that's the most important thing that Otto I ever did, right? Even just as a consequence, as a crowning accomplishment of the victory over the Magyars in Germany. No, right? Widukind cannot dismiss that, cannot say, of course, as Otto's biographer, that these things had not happened or that were not important. He uses this rhetorical experience. He says that Otto's glorious campaigns in Italy during the 60s of the 10th century, together with his triumphant entries into Rome, like a truly Roman emperor, were beyond Widukind's own ability to describe. Which, of course, sounds just an excuse, right? In his writings, what Widukind did not really want here it was not even just a provincial view of the world, right? It was not, it's complex, right? Because also this ruler was, again, accomplishing somewhere else with the same Eastern Frankish means. There was something greater there happening with the Byzantines. But what happens, like here, most likely in Widukind's mind is that he could not admit that a Saxon ruler, that as we've seen, like he cares very much, stressing about the fact that he was already emperor before going to Italy, would receive, in this sense, any form of honor from popes or Romans. This is a great issue. You can go as far as the Protestant Reformation and seeing aspects of this, like in the rise of national monarchies, in the detachment, to some degree of, say, that would happen historically in the disgregation of Christian unity. So, of course, like the Catholic one as well. And it is actually a very serious issue, right? Here there was a clear denunciation by Widukind of the, say, essentially worthlessness. I mean, you can't see it in any other way, of any form of Roman recognition of Ottonian power. Which is something that the Ottonians themselves, will see, especially Otto I, had problems with at the beginning because of this evident sense of, like, what do my men think? Like, what do my clienteles, my power base in Germany think about this? Because it's not like it's over. Like, as we said before, these rulers would be in Italy, they would be against the Slavs, they would be against the Western Franks. I mean, it wasn't like, okay, you simply gather this land and, everybody's obeying you. It's actually a much more complex story. And it is one also of evident favoritism towards the idea, of course, of a Mediterranean empire, as we were saying before, as opposed to a Central European one by the side of the same rulers that were obviously very much attracted to Rome, and the possibility of the ecumenic bridge, the reunion of the two churches, Constantinople, etc. I say reunion because, of course, there was a sense that the empire had sort of, we'll see it now better, sort of, the two empires, at least, that's a heresy to say, but because the empire is only one, but the fact that this had been split, at least, because of ultimate incapacity in historical perspective between two powers rather than one, that would unite in Rome anyway, was too alluring, was too attractive. Except for those who thought that, of course, their Saxony in this case would have been sort of neglected in this process. Actually, we do not know exactly what Otto thought himself. Widukind finds this expedient, again, of recognizing Otto's imperial authority before any pope or Roman had anything to say about that, because of the Saxon glory that was self-justifying as in a new imperial heroic sense. We definitely know that on Otto the Great's epitaph, he indeed referred to himself as Imperator Romanorum, that is, of course, Emperor of the Romans, a title, however, that Otto had not used himself that frequently, right? Well, he really didn't need it. Like, if you look at that he needed it, of course, very much in certain political context, let's say, but as a whole, right, he could play using it or not using it depending on the situation. Otto's chancery itself preferred the more neutral title of Imperator Augustus. Augustus, remember, comes from the verb augere, right? It's the equivalent of Sebastos in Greek. It has sense of, in fact, augmentation, you see, from Augustus, of the imperial transcendental achievement. Right, and one of the reasons why actually he would not boast it, which otherwise, especially in the West, would have simplified a lot most of the times, was expectedly the fact that negotiations with the Byzantine court were ongoing to recognize from the side of Constantinople the Romanity of his title. Remember that the Byzantines would never actually recognize the Romanity of the Western emperors. They would recognize the term emperor, but not the Romanity, which is also like, say, factually incorrect. Like, also in a metaphysical sense, you can argue that these Western rulers had the same right, by the same archaic meaning, actually, of the empire, of the Roman Empire, to boast this title as much as the Easterners. Now, the say important aspect of this is also the fact that Widukind enhanced his wording with another epithet that was Rex Gentium, so King of the Peoples, which was interesting because the say sacred royalty, something that in a sense does call for the Imperium, in part sort of contains it, and that in this case was in fact mirrored by the extension of power of control over other peoples. This, of course, went in parallel with the justification for ascribing imperial stature to Otto the Great, because, as we've seen before, like look at how all the peoples he rules on, he is an emperor just by himself, without some other recognition. Now, besides what Widukind thought in general, the main channel through which Otto passed in order to be recognized as actually Roman Emperor in February 962 in Rome is strikingly similar to the Carolingian one in 800. It was probably really felt in the same way, in the sort of like the empire has been vacant vibe, right, for centuries, and or at least in this case for generations, and the re-achievement of this Catholic unity manifest in imperial power has to be celebrated with the recognition of Romanity that essentially pushes this authority over the horizon. Of course, there were all the reasons here. We mentioned the Byzantines. Lots of stuff was going on. We will have to talk about the various pontificates here, especially one, in fact, John XII, who crowned Otto, and that really were strategic moves by the papacy, aimed at restoring the same papal authority under a new protector, right? Because the papacy, of course, was in Rome, but as we've seen, it was also controlled by the local nobility, for which every pope came from, and at least having this other protector that would always have difficulties in controlling Rome as a decentralized southern possession. It was not even a possession, in fact it was the main point of contention, would have allowed, again, to negotiate, to make sort of the papal power rise, and especially win some rights, or say the confirmation of previous rights that would allow the further expansion of papal authority within the same Italy. It seems impossible that we still haven't talked about that in a single video. Made lots of videos about the papacy and the papal states in general, but these earlier centuries are incredibly underrated. The same Pope John II, whose pontificate lasted from 955, that was also the one of accession of Otto in Germany, in 964, it was a coincidence naturally, was a member of the aforementioned aristocratic house of the Theophylact, which, as we've seen, had been dominating Rome since the early 10th century. It was incredibly noble families of Rome that could trace their ancestry back to like very even late antique roots in some cases. I don't think necessarily this one, but that surely embodied that continuity of Romanity in an absolute sense, in a political, in an ethnic, in a culturally hegemonic sense, right? Rome, I can't stress enough how, say, in terms of literal, say, civilizational output, how much it was directing the development of the entire Western Europe, and really beyond, right, stretching, especially now when enhanced by Ottonian power, like its power, like up to like beyond, like contending the entire Europe and effectively succeeding in hegemonizing it, keeping the same Constantinople out. The church was not yet sort of divided as we intended, but de facto it really was. Like the Byzantine church was already something on its own, and Rome was just like exceptional in her role, for which, yes, in theory she was within the same, say, it was nobody's power, nobody's earthly power, but it was still considered like in between, right? And able, from the papal side, in fact, to control both both empires. The main problem that John XII had was the aforementioned secular influence of Italic rulers such as Berengar II of Ivrea. These were the main houses like Spoleto, Ivrea, Tuscany, Friuli, like these were the main centers. We talked in part about the Hugh of Provence. There is all, again, a quite interesting back and forth, like a contention over the Italic crown, and in fact also the imperial one, by these provincial rulers. And Berengar had been ruling, in fact, as king of Italy since 950. Now, one possible action for the Pope was, in fact, supporting, in this context, Otto the Great, right, who had married Adelheid of Burgundy in 951. This woman was very important. We've seen her in the videos, especially about medieval Burgundy, because she had been the widow of the previous Italian ruler, that was Lothar, ruling between 948 and 950 against the same Berengar II. So Burgundy had been quite active in against Provence, also in Italy. The Italic nobility had chosen at some point some Burgundian rulers. Now the Ottonians basically were taking that upper Burgundy over, and managing to, in fact, secure important Alpine passes, and this is what eventually leads also to the Italian expedition. Papal envoys had been traveling to Germany for this to happen since 960. Now, as you know, the popes were not particularly eager, especially considering their temporal power in Rome and the surroundings, at least mixed, as we've seen, one of the various Roman aristocratic houses, to have this enormous interference in his own affairs. This is, in historical perspective, like what would actually happen in Ottonian times. We talked so much about the Gregorian reforms and everything leading to them, including, in fact, the Ottonian policy and propaganda of, say, purifying the church from secular influence, namely the one of anyone who was not them. And of course, this was partly justified by imperial authority, but not much by the difference that existed on the two levels, like the temporal and the spiritual one, that in fact the church would come also to claim for its own, right? You can argue that at the time of Louis the Pius, Rome, so the papacy, of course, was in arms under the Franks. This happens again with the Saxons, that will essentially for a long time hegemonize like the papal appointment process, and not everybody in Italy was okay with that, including those, in fact, nobiliar families that in Rome would see their powers stripped in that fashion. In fact, it would never be easy for any of these rulers to actually control, not even for Otto III, who literally started living, as we've seen in Rome, in the place of the former Roman emperors, like the control on the city, the full control in Italy. There are lots of dynamics that prefigure, as you know, in fact, this struggle within the church, and the church hegemonized by the Germans, and the rural sort of secular nobility more opposed to that, and eventually giving rise to wars and clashes like the ones at the Patria of Milan, that was the most important city in Italy, in at least politically, like later on in the 11th century. And this is definitely starting from this point, in a time in which yet the Roman families, and including like John the XII, had not really seen how dangerous like the arrival of this new emperor, right, could really be. In fact, John the XII, that was the same one who had called Otto to Rome, would be probably, say, dissatisfied with the actual effectiveness with which the Germans had seized Italy in 961, right? There was, again, an Italic nobility, but this sort of stood down, and or those who fought against the Ottonians were beaten. And the fragmented nature of the country, the lack of that sort of political unity, just for basically at this point any other power but the Eastern Frankish one could really do about this. And consider that Otto was seen as a hero because, of course, he had stabilized the situation, not just in Germany, but also in Italy, and even as far as, say, Western France and in Spain, as the Magyar raids had hit up to, in fact, southern Italy and, again, northern France. And even though Germany had been, of course, the more beaten country by these incursions, overall, like, what happens after 955 is that the Magyars stop entirely to go west. They try a bit like south of the Danube. They see it's not a great idea, and they start essentially to settle down for good and establishing what would become fundamentally the Kingdom of Hungary in a couple of generations. Now, Otto the Great was a great commander, a great ruler, a great warrior. All right, he was like pretty much like what we would expect from the context which he had raised. He was not particularly literate at all. Actually, he had a pretty strong vision. In fact, he was a very energetic person, right? And so he was prepared to extend his empire as far as the formal title was concerned as well, right? Aside from, as we've seen, what we have observed concerning Romanity, the issues with the Byzantines internationally were very delicate, but also paradoxically at home. So after consecrating the new emperor, Pope John XII declared that one of the motives for this action was, of course, to reward Otto as the conqueror of the heathen nations, and as the defender of the Christian Church with a triumphal crown conferred by the apostolic prestige of St. Peter. right? So the most triumphant medium of in fact, divine glory and imperial power that could ever be obtained, right? Romanly so. Now, the reference to the heathens is also very interesting because it's not just about the Magyars. Like, nations is properly told as a story. Like, we'll have to make more videos about how the Eastern Frankish kingdom coped with not just the Magyars but the Slavs that were a bit following their trail, their lead. The same Vikings that did hit Germany to an important extent. And so the general role that the Saxons had, in fact, in the northeastern frontier of Christendom, in Europe, there were Christians in other, even very far away places, of course, but here we're talking, of course, about the now properly Roman world. And this role of defender, after like this early phases of the 10th century, essentially this had been the hardest moments in which the second invasions had hit. Like, the Ottonians would also commit themselves against the Saracens in southern Italy, by the way, with disastrous consequence, as it happened in Cremona under Otto's son in 982. But there was a real sense that, and we made lots of videos about post-Carolingian Europe, that of course Western Christendom had been under attack, that there was a general sense of precarity, which of course a new ruler had to rise, somebody who would, a strong man, would put things back in order together with this primigenial, like primitive, violent, brutal force, but still one that was sanctioned by God. And it's not like the Saxons didn't know how that worked, given what had happened to them under Charlemagne. So they were actually the best people at this point for that task. This is how, say, Otto rose in perspective. There was something about this, you see, modernity of the imperial Roman Frankish grandeur and wealth connected with the brutal primitivity and bloodthirstiness of the Saxons. That really makes that civilizational power, right, springing out. Essentially, in Germany, the Ottonian power was based on Saxony and on Franconia. It was literally like the perfect mix, right, of the two poles that would amalgamate and balance each other to perfection. Of course, things were very complicated, and these rulers would always be on the march, would always be on horseback, would always have their swords dripping in blood. They really were men of iron, of courage, of determination, of ruthlessly violent training, upbringing. They were really military machines, right? There is no doubt about this. We made videos about the Ottonian military. There is nothing extremely distinctive. Actually, you can argue nothing distinctive at all about the Ottonians, say, as opposed to, I don't know, the Western Franks or the Italics, in the way they waged war. But in fact, as Clausewitzians, we know that there was a matter of moral force involved that really had made the difference. It's even more striking considering that they came essentially from the least developed part of the empire. That's really mind-blowing, and it tells you how everything makes system when there is really a lot of civilization at work. And here it's a great Romano-Germanic accomplishment, to say the least. Now, it's meaningful that the papacy would know this. In fact, it would align very closely with Carolingian conceptions of the purpose of the neo-Roman imperial office. In a way, the popes were blessing Charlemagne for doing what he would actually do he had actually been doing by that point on the Saxons, just like now the Pope was doing to the Saxons against other peoples that in fact would also Christianize and civilize accordingly. In a sense, Otto the Great did acknowledge that papal involvement was both necessary and desirable for the restoration of the Western Empire. And the Ottonians knew better because the Saxons were aware of the deeper meaning of redemption that the Translatio Imperii had essentially rewarded them with. And so a military acclamation in the style suggested by Widukind of Corvey and the de facto dominance over the other gentes were, however, not quite sufficient. It's not hard to understand why Otto found his inspiration. Of course, he was talking about the coronation and imperium of Charlemagne, right? And this is what he had to insist the most on. It would have simply put him on the same. It was here a comparable level of regional power. Right? It's not to say that also things did not matter. The world had not changed. Like, it was a bigger deal to some extent to have achieved what he did, right, from Saxony, and also in this heavily, for example, as it was starting to be encastellated world and clashing, also the same, and defeating properly the same peoples that had started attacking the empire. There were, of course, more specifically Eastern Frankish or even Saxon dimensions to this, but this wouldn't help as much as the ones existing with Carolingian accomplishments. The sources that directly report Otto's proclamation as emperor, that are Adalbert of St. Maximin's continuation of Regino of Prum's chronicle, and Liutprand of Cremona's aforementioned Liber de Ottone Rege, take a radically different approach from that of Widukind of Corvey, as they celebrate, in fact, the event as a positive achievement for both the Pope and the Emperor. Right? There is not that sense of provincial Saxon. I don't want to know what even the guy did. Yes, it's so great, but it's beyond my understanding. We'll not talk about it. He was already emperor before, and forget about the fact that he was crowned by the Pope and elected by the Romans. That's not important. And there is also, right, in these last two, let's say, talking about the continuation of Regino of Prum and Liutprand's Liber, the provision of little insight, however, in the Carolingian precedent. The significance of this precedent is evidenced by one of the most important documents produced by Otto I's Chancery with papal assistance, known as the Diploma Ottonianum, in fact, which confirms the rights and resources of the Roman See in Italy. Why is this so important? Because those sources were, of course, celebrating Otto, but were also looking at it, not necessarily a detached way, but you see, these authors weren't quite as Saxon, right? And the sense was that they were highlighting most of what occurred, right, in a plain historical sense, and of course biased in favor of Otto and everything. But what Otto cared about the most was this international recognition that the papacy could provide, not just through the crowning, but through this further negotiation of, say, spheres of influence, and most importantly, like the type of mechanism that regulated the imperial interference in the papal elections. This is an incredibly important aspect because the Roman See in Italy was really looking forward to reactivate that level of political and territorial recognition in the peninsula that, in a sense, had already been, laid as a foundation in the pact established back in the day, 754, between Pepin the Short and Pope Stephen II. which would be further reiterated by Charlemagne 20 years later for Pope Hadrian I. Like, he was actually a child with a witness to that meeting with Stephen II and his father back in the day. And this all had revolved around how much the popes could demand in terms of what pertained to them, to the Patrimonium Sancti Petri in the peninsula, and that in theory should have not been controlled by the emperors, should have not just simply pertained to them. That was the church's, it was God's, and it technically didn't even belong to any earthly secular power, right? So what had been done at Pontion back in that 754 had really, not really boxed the emperors, but sort of had secured their status, in that case as kings of the Franks, and later with Charlemagne, of course, like properly Roman emperors, to recognize something in exchange to the papacy. And again, the extent by which the papacy would have been controlled in turn, ecclesiastically wise, by the same emperors was another issue, and that's in fact the one that the emperors would mostly try to push for. But it was incredibly important for the same control of Italy to have a strong papal support, and therefore, like all a system like of interconnection that would also, of course, benefit also from the strengthening of the same papal power over other sees, like the one of Ravenna, for example, had been historically competitive with Rome, at least in a territorial sense, and that could help, in fact, the same emperors to remain in charge, because saying as long as there is an authority that makes that happen, also the popes will be sort of more lenient and at least reassured in terms of like the imperial intervention in Italy and the general cooperation locally. And consider at this point that Otto would come back to Germany. Like, it's not like he was living in the peninsula. So at this point in history especially, the popes still thought that they could simply benefit from the reactivation of the empire thanks to the general stabilization of the system. There were different, routes of expansion for the Germans, and yet Italy, as we've seen, was so central in itself, and papal power growing so significant for sanctioning such Renovatio Imperii, that there wasn't really a possibility that things wouldn't grow sort of that toxic as they would do in a while. The 962 Diploma Ottonianum historical version of the facts precedents involved is quite interesting, because it inaccurately refers, historically at least, to the Carolingian kings as if they had already been emperors. Right? This may be a lapsus or something, in fact, reminiscent of what the same Widukind was saying in parallel to the Ottonians today. But this is the point, that even this error serves to reinforce the ideological significance of the past in the restoration of a truly new Roman Empire at this point in 962. They were really seen as imperium bearers. Like, what objectively the Pope does is sanctioning this through a higher authority, but it's like, I don't know, the Roman victorious general that comes to Rome, in fact, to within the holy city to have his status sanctioned, actually to remit to God what had been bestowed upon him at that point. This is very, 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 very similar to what is happening with the papacy here, in the literal same way that those victorious Roman commanders would do, entering Rome in that triumph. So never underestimate how significant even these details, even when historically inaccurate really would mean in the mentality of the people who were writing them. Now, despite the unresolved difficulties in interpreting the aforementioned diploma, this represents the closest approach that we can confidently make to understanding how the Eastern Frankish court at this point perceived the restoration of the empire. Right? This tells you also how limited it is. You can't really know, right? There aren't other types of sources that tell you what, I don't know, Otto I was thinking or whatever. You can't sort of imagine that on the basis, of course, of some historical evidence, say anthropologically, religiously. There is a lot to draw from, and we should exercise ourselves a bit more into that, because this Restauratio Imperii was not only the one of the Roman Empire, but also of the Frankish one, in that same Catholic sequence. Memories of the latter, for example, like the Frankish power, were likely easier for a 10th century German to grasp than references to the classical Roman past, which, I don't know, for example, in Italy would have been sort of much more familiar. This is important also, as we've seen, for what Widukind had said, right, and how these people sort of saw themselves sort of individually accomplishing something that they would hardly perceive it in a Catholic sense. But this is very important to stress, because it's not like, say, when the Western Roman Empire evaporated, these individual peoples were necessarily thinking of themselves as more performing than the empire itself was, nor actually seeing themselves as part of a broader Catholic sequence, especially a people like the Saxons that had remained in the Barbaricum and basically had had nothing to do, nor at that point, with Romanity or Christianity. Of course, they knew well what the empire had been, but of course, there had been some of them who had migrated into Britain, mostly not to return. In that case, appreciating the ruins of Rome, but in this sense, still remaining confined to that essentially provincial dimension, right? Invading the Rhineland every once in a while, beating the Thuringians, and making shady deals with the same Franks to take out completely the latter, and eventually being conquered by the Franks as well. And so think this also culturally, like, who were these people? What kind of historical memory did they have? What kind of, scale they thought their own personal ethnic accomplishments at, right? If you think about it, what Widukind said about, I don't want to talk about Italy, essentially, it's sort of like you would think the greatest conquest, as they are presented but not described, would be, in fact, so interesting to show. No, he wants to eliminate that part. It's as if it is sort of incredibly incoherent, if you want, with the Catholic sense of power. And this definitely dates back to the specific feeling. Of course, Widukind was also another human type compared to Aemilius, to same Otto. The latter would obviously, of course, always embark themselves in the highest of the enterprises. It was a completely different story, but also maybe in the average Saxon Aemilius was entering Rome, seeing a completely different world than he thought, the one he thought it existed at Similia. Like, there wouldn't be perhaps that sort of other sense, but following his own leader, right? This guy that was accomplishing so much to the point that individually he would be incredibly emboldened by, like, made proud of, but that wouldn't be fully understood in the higher sort of international and historical and universal implications, other than this very, say, man-to-man relation. This is incredibly important. You could argue it also for, I don't know, the Vikings that were going to Constantinople at this point. I made a video, of course, about the Varangians, and so there is an affinity even between these populations. It must not be underestimated. Who were they? Where were they when the Roman Empire existed, for example? And where had they been in the last few centuries? See, the Franks had a different story. And here, also the same. You see, there is not much the transformation, as I explained in that video, from, say, a Saxon to a Roman power, but one of from a Frankish to a Roman power. And I think that the reason why this is the same that we have exposed with Rome here for what the Saxons would feel like with the same Franks. I mean, the Franks had conquered the Saxons. They weren't Saxons. They were sort of similar to them, actually. If you look at, say, Austrasia, of course, like, and Saxony, they're similar places. Not so, like, of course, identical or simply exchangeable. But even in that, like, the Ottonians chose to be like the heirs to the Franks because they were, in Germany, kings not of Germany. They were kings of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, which is a very different thing. And now, like and of course, the Frankish kingdom, the Carolingian, had stemmed in that sense also from the, at least in Germany, from the Carolingian, as part of the Carolingian Empire. And as such, it was already part of a Roman Catholic, Frankish, ordained universal empire, rather than a Nazio or another. So this is extremely important because it shows you how, say, there were all different levels of who would believe what, depending on their role in the estate's hierarchy, in their national role, and in I'd say in the general also level of understanding, literally of the same. And so when you look, for example, at the Saxon nun Roswitha of Gandersheim, incredibly famous author, we will talk about her in some video soon. I don't know when actually, but multiple videos actually. In her account of Otto the Great's reign, she was following in the footsteps of Notker Balbulus of the monastery of St. Gallen by employing the theory of the Translatio Imperii, or devolution of the empire, to illustrate the connection between the Carolingian Empire and the Eastern Frankish regime of her time, which eventually evolved into the renewed Ottonian Imperium. And there is a very providential vision of how things work. This would remain also historically if you read Dante or if you study Scholastic, that there was something about this that was detaching essentially from the idea that victory could simply be bestowed on someone out of absolute merit, and that there was actually a providence that was guiding, coming from the rest of the world as an actual collective accomplishment, but in fact devoid still of that absoluteness that just God and Christ in this case would have accomplished. Roswitha states that, quote, "The King of Kings, so Christ, who alone rules forever, by his own power changing the fortunes of all kings, decreed that the distinguished realm of the Franks be transferred to the famous race of the Saxons," and so on, which is a very female way of seeing this, like a female, a nun, right? So it's, again, very adulterated from what the average, again, and not very much literate and contemplative, say, oriented Saxon Milas would have actually thought of the story, which is much closer to what actually Widukind had seen. That is to say, this is my imperium. I achieved that. Or we, the Saxons, at a bigger level. The rest has nothing to do with it, right? Instead, Roswitha, that is actually a very highly cultured and educated person, sees things at a higher level, but at the same time, she does so by saying that there is some providential design for which, at a point, the empire passes to different peoples. Which is a very interesting way of seeing it, except there are some problems with the traditional interpretation at a limit. This is, at least, you can't oppose yourself to providence, especially even if you are the one who has that providence, which I think you know that etymologically in Latin means simply the capacity of foreseeing the future, because you're able to actualize yourself into it. And so you see here the subject for her is Christ, and it couldn't be otherwise. So you see you have to meet some standards in the process. And so what you're left to witness to some extent is the fact that, as it did happen in European history, like it's difficult in Europe to look at a country and say, well, this country at some point in history did not have its moment of peak. It wasn't like the greatest, the most powerful, something. We all shared this to some extent. And this is a way of saying, like, I don't know, first this people, then the other, and there is a design into that. And naturally, whatever ambitions the protagonists of that era had in mind regarding the restoration of the restored Roman Empire, that, let's stress it, had never ended, right, in the West. Of course, there had been, at some point, the imperial title had been vacant, but it's not like the imperium wasn't there, right? It would find full sanction through this papal and imperial mutual recognition, but it wasn't something that had ended. Like, even in this, as we've seen, more provincial rulers, that at a point all these actors had been. So 962, the papacy ended up receiving more than it anticipated in terms of imperial protection, right? And in interference, of course. This was the price of restoring the Roman Empire in the West. This was due to the fact that the emperors acquired at this point the right to scrutinize and essentially confirm papal elections, a power they utilized on several occasions to secure the appointment of pontiffs who aligned, of course, with their own interests. There is all a phase of, say, German popes, for example. This kind of influence was ultimately repudiated, as we know well for all the videos that we made about the 11th century, the Gregorian reforms, again, so when the papal elections would finally be restricted by decree to the College of Cardinals in 1051, and so formally subtracting it from any imperial ingerence. Pope John XII expressed regret regarding his own arrangements with Otto I, as we've seen, renouncing to them the very year later. And this led, in fact, to the same expulsion of the Pope from Rome. Pretty turbulent things were going on again. We'll have to go back on that part of Roman history. Now, according to the sources, it was the same Otto who held at that point the high moral ground in politics over the papal court. Like Pope John XIII, on the throne of Peter between 965 and 972, recognized that of all the emperors that had existed, Otto was the most distinguished after the same Constantine the Great and Theodosius the Great. Right, so even before Charlemagne, which is actually very important because not even in the German mythology, like of course Otto came before Charlemagne. And of course, this was a contingentally propagandistic idea. So who are the other two? Constantine, of course, that is, see, in the Middle Ages is seen, even like by Charlemagne, it would have been seen like probably the only first true great emperor, right? Because he was believed to have been a Christian in absolute terms, and of course allowing Christianity to legally spread, and what was seen in fact in an already Christian empire. Theodosius the Great sanctioned the Christianity of Romanity, with Saint Ambrose like serving that specific ideology and sanctioning it further theologically. So we're talking here literally about a guy in Otto that restored the universal order in the highest possible way. And this was really the highest form of celebration, showing how much at this point the Ottonians, of course, already controlled the papacy, right? Furthermore, Bishop Liutprand of Cremona attributed a panegyric to the Romans that encapsulated the supposed imperial virtues. And he said, the emperor, as we have learned by experience, knows, works, and loves the things of God. He guards the affairs of the church and state with his sword, adorns them with his virtues, and purifies them through his laws. And the latter reference is possibly to the Diploma Ottonianum itself. Right? This is yet another beautifully traditional idea. The fact that, of course, the emperor can perscrutate the imperscrutable. He is, in many ways, like the closest man to God. If you want to pair with the papacy, but Liutprand had a very negative opinion, at least of the Roman families that had, it was following Ottonian propaganda, right? That had, in fact, corrupted the same papal office. So there was something greater, more majestic, more authoritative in the sacred royalty that would have sort of incarnated that idea of a spiritual and temporal power combined, like in even pre-Christian times, to a degree, even though this is not what it specifically meant. In the sublimation of this doctrine was sort of approaching it in the same way. Now, the aforementioned sources are considered tainted in the sense that, as we've seen, John the 13th and Liutprand of Cremona were simply men associated to the imperial court. And so you have the literal pope, you have this imperial ambassador to Constantinople, that are loyal subjects of the empire, and Otto that wielded it. However, they do testify as well the degree of autonomy and in thinking, and especially regarding to the fact that after a turbulent and successful reign north of the Alps, Otto I was able to build upon the Italian claims opened to him by his marriage to Adelaide of Italy, that are sort of called him, like to save her, right, from prison, and proceed to restore the empire. So these Italians were seeing Otto's reign as, of course, providential, and especially capable of fixing a lot of the issues that had, up to that point, like prevented Italy even just to successfully defend itself from the Magyars. I mean, in part, yes, there had been some ambushes successful against this the peoples of the steppes loaded in loot coming back to Hungary, but overall, right, there had been terrible events like political fragmentation, a sense of disorder, lack of central authority. And Otto, in part, had not just, say, of course, he had not, as we've seen, come to rule from Italy and simply unified this country in an absolute political sense, because he had come back to the north that was also far from being sort of unified politically, and so it was always like a pretty tumultuous era nevertheless. But the general stabilization, the end of the Magyar encouraged. Like this was like a huge deal, right? And finally having somebody who could claim like to be both King of Italy and Holy Roman Emperor without basically anyone else trying to strip his own throne, and being always there and coming back multiple times to Italy, and as you've seen also securing Burgundy, etc., was seen as like a blessing of God, considering the previous times following to the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire. Naturally, there are recriminations among Otto's supporters and as adversaries, evoking the controversy surrounding the evaluation of the same Charlemagne crowning back in the still it was technically the 8th century, because it's the 9th, only 7 days after that Christmas night of 800, and the convoluted blend of ecclesiastical Frankish and Roman traditions and ambitions, of course, were seen still as, something to more firmly settle. The ecclesiastical issue, if you want, had never really ended. It wouldn't ever really end, because you can argue that the investiture controversy began as early as that 754, or at least when the Franks took over for good the Italic kingdom. Because nobody really understood, like nobody had really defined in a absolutely universal, consensual sense what the real relation, say the various pertinences, because the relation at least had to be, of course, positive and cooperative, but let's say the various pertinences of the two universal powers, which is again what would bring again in the following century to the Gregorian reforms and more. For a century, in fact, the Eastern Frankish court would, on the whole, maintain a reasonably secure influence over papal politics. It's not again that they were in Italy all the time, nor that they would, even when in Rome, able to control the city that easily or anything, but they were able to impress that ecclesiastically reformistic manner that was idealistic, if not always popular in Italy, and that would paradoxically foster that higher sense of the true centrality of the papacy in the broader world, which is something that would be truly felt by Sylvester II, connected with Otto III, that would eventually seal this recurrent crumbling of the of rule of the empire, of the issues in Germany and in Italy, while the papacy actually was, even if a smaller and not so at all militarized or mighty, say, secular power, however, remain more solid in its institutional role, with a sort of much older, of course, cultural, historical, spiritual backbone that eventually would be able to emancipate itself once again from the interference of the German emperors. As we've seen, there would be, of course, numerous admirers of the German emperors in Italy, such as Liutprand of Cremona, who asserted that the turmoil of the period before 961 was jeopardizing the future well-being of Italy. However, of course, this was not like a universal view. Some Italians lamented the arrival of the Germans. It wasn't much like say you can't distinguish the two things, of course, but I'd say it was understood that, of course, the necessity of an imperial ruler, as long as, of course, you didn't have to billet some Saxon knights along the way. There was a lot of exactions required for the military expeditions, etc., so it wasn't that light. But at the same time, it was still like a functional phase. There was a lot of also reinforcement of previous Italic powers, namely in the bishops within the cities. This would help tremendously the development of the communes, that in a way would be also in this sense paradoxically the main resistance to the imperial demands, to their autonomies later on. But it's important to see how institutionally and politically the things sort of started from here. Of course, there was a lot of Greek-West relations, notions. It would be interesting. We always get the sense that, I don't know, Germany and Italy are the poles of the antithetic poles of Europe. They're not at all. Like, as a matter of fact, in this time in history, there was a very strong interconnection, and one that was just to increase through the Holy Roman Empire in the following centuries. And it was understood in a, say, functional sense. Like, the local Italic communities were indeed favored by this, let's say, the stabilization of power. Exactions or not, this would not prevent Italy to skyrocket. This was actually the most advanced land, the one that where encapsulation had begun earlier. This would happen much later. In some parts of northeastern Germany, this wouldn't be, I think, before the beginning of the 12th century. So we have too much this idea of an impositive reign rather than, say, communities that choose what kind of leaders they want, just like the Saxons would have done, because without the decisive moral support of the population, you can't really have any government work. And of course, still this would remain, as we've seen, vastly decentralized, with lots of local autonomies reinforced by the same locals. And of course, there were a lot of appointees, a lot of Germans around in general, and this is yet another story, but it's also how the system would work in itself. There is an interesting source that we can cite that sheds a bit of a darker note, which exactly the grandeur of Rome is counterposed to essentially the barbarism of the Ottonians that surely weren't going to Italy for beneficence at all, and that did fight, killed, looted, and more. This is the chronicler Benedict of Mount Soracte, north of Rome, very famous because of Horace's poetry. This chronicler invoked the classical image of Rome, contrasting it with the nefarious subjugation to Otto I and Otto II. Right? And he says, "Woe to Rome, oppressed and trampled upon by so many peoples, taken prisoner by the Saxon king. Your townsfolk are ruled by the sword, and your strength has entirely vanished." It's a recurring theme also in sort of medieval literature, at least mostly complained by the Italians, that nevertheless managed to remain always that decentralized and actually much richer than, Germany or whatever. But they felt it, right? It's sort of a national character to complain a lot about the situation and then still finding a way out, right, without being too much satisfied by it anyway. They carry off your gold and silver by the sackful. At the height of your power, Rome, you triumphed over the peoples, cast the world into the dust. It was a terribly beautiful idea. And subdued the kings of the earth. You held the scepter and the highest authority. Now you are thoroughly pillaged and plundered by the Saxon kings. And there is a lot of rhetoric, of course, in the entire work and whatever, but it's very beautiful, especially when you think that, say, the Roman Empire had not fallen even half of a millennium before. It is not yet to say that, of course, that's not a long time. But if you think about it in perspective, like these peoples had sort of known each other. Like the Romans knew who the Saxons were half of a millennium before, and vice versa. And of course, it was something. There were lots of Saxons in Rome, by the way. They were not continental Saxons; they were mostly Anglo-Saxons, because of the early, of course, relation existing between Rome and England since the time of Gregory the Great, the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, and that were in a sense very Roman, in a historical sense at this point, like half of a millennium. And that was a very cosmopolitan century in the first place. And that in this key, however, like looks at this other continental, almost northern European people coming from essentially just a, relatively underdeveloped area, but not even relatively, like literally an underdeveloped area in Germany. In order to be powerful, you can have just like a more compact land of these, and this is also to say how, of course, especially in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, the differences in surplus were not dramatic, but surely Eastern Francia was the least developed of the post-Carolingian lands, and thinking once we ruled over the world, we crushed these peoples every day, and now they command over us. And except there is a bit, as I was just saying, of not really of a hypocrisy, but like in part perhaps just when you think of the fact that it's not like a random, like first of all, there wasn't like a Saxon empire equating the Roman one or whatever, even at this point, because of the very nature, in fact, of which this empire worked and was established. But in fact, there had been an enormous Italian participation to the establishment of the Ottonian Empire. And this Renovatio Imperii, that if you think about it in a broader sense, yes, did not really, it went close actually to re-achieve the reunification of the East and the West, and really creating a Mediterranean empire, but was also, in fact, finally sort of ousted in a practical sense, in historical perspective, and that actually was the empire, was truly the victorious in arms that managed to restore like the possibility of coming back to the one, and that however failed, yes, and failed because of course like humanity was going downhill in the first place, as the same fall of Rome had showed, and now these other peoples were struggling and just to be at the same possible level, and needing this compromise, needing this intrigue, needing this sort of even ambiguous relations that would sort of always remain between the papacy and the empire in order to stay afloat in a world that, again, with this real power was wielded. It's not like the Ottonians didn't have like a truly regional power or something. They were quite impressive, telling the truth, but they were also among other powers, and so this is what makes you think regarding the sort of the originality, at least of the unity of the Roman Empire in that ecumenic sense, and you can appreciate better the effort of these medieval powers to restore that, even like fighting. This is not a matter of technology, this is not a matter of, it's really about the actual sense of sacred being reevaluated for the sake of a responsible future and world salvation. So this is mostly what the entire thing really revolves around. And so it's always interesting to discuss these topics because they are really as, I think, as relevant as one may think, right? It's difficult. Like the 10th century is difficult. The 10th century is really an iron century, and it is that painful, and it is that sort of difficult to appreciate even the machination of all this power establishment, negotiation, maintenance. It's tough, right? It's costly, it's complex. But you want to look at these maps and appreciate that Germany, Italy, and these are vast areas in Europe were brought under, again, a single rule by name. In many areas also de facto, not the majority of them, nevertheless, and especially being able from this to to really form an axis of stabilization in Western civilization. This is yet also like some underrated aspect, and indeed, say, emphasis of the dysfunctionality of the, at least the aiming purpose of the Holy Roman Empire. We sort of forget the fact that this system remained practically unchanged until the 19th century, when France finally managed to do what Charlemagne had accomplished back in the day, from more or less the same geographical direction, and that had sort of stabilized the same development of Europe, like the longitudinally, latitudinally, and maintaining especially alive the necessity of the centrality of Rome, of the imperial power, and so of a model of reference that was not really seen elsewhere, in that seriousness of the actual office and how this had to be, say, lived traditionally, as opposed to other areas of Europe that, as we will see in other videos that I have prepared, I will discuss sort of soon, wouldn't actually develop as successfully. Right? If you speak of the West, in which, say, the universal, say, papacy and empire would actually just operate in a very coordinating sense. We talk about, of course, England, France, the Iberian monarchies, etc. You realize that this is Europe, right? This is, together with Germany, Italy, and essentially at least some polities that at the time also, like, more or less comprised in modern countries, do not exist anymore, is really the deal. It's really the most advanced, it's really the most developed, the most stable, the one that monopolizes eventually, as we've seen with the Mediterranean trade, with the internal production, so the overall military power that resisted to, big deal, had been resisting already, actually, and this is not yet a becoming. It is a becoming, but I mean, it's not something that has yet to happen, right? It is happening already. Otto I is an embodiment of that, in this incredible effort and magnificent achievement, right? And so it's something that you want to appreciate, also looking at modern Europe and thinking, you know what, like, if even like also in other countries, like, things, I don't know, you can look at British and French liberalism a bit as the peak in modern contemporary terms of what is meant to be modernity, contemporaneity, leaving aside the criticisms towards modernity in a narrow sense, or at least in a limiting sense. Like, this happened also because in the Middle Ages, this central European axis managed to stabilize along the lines of a universal principle the entire continent, and pushing its boundaries beyond, and allowing for the rest of the system to expand further, also from different bases. This is extremely important. I think it's one of those underrated aspects of the Renovatio Imperii that I'm also sort of rediscovering myself, because you often think at the things how happen and always seeing, oh my god, but it wasn't perfect. Well, nothing really is. Imagine if what had been accomplished in the Renovatio Imperii had not happened. What Europe would have really looked like. Right? This is an enormous achievement. The centrality of Germany, for example, in this axis in Europe, and the Roman revival, the centrality of Rome, the reformation of the church, the papal monarchy, these are all things that, have a massive, right, a massive magnitude, impact on the history of mankind, right? This is not just something you say, well, it depends, right? No, this is really a massive center of gravity that you can't quite ignore in the output, and especially in the following centuries. And of course, again, there are the specificities, there are shortcomings. This is not, of course, again, to cross out either. It's very interesting. I should always talk about it in a complementary sense in this regard. We will surely keep talking about the Renovatio Imperii, the Ottonian Empire. Still really have to do a lot. Really, it's incredible how much we still have to. Like, we haven't even began to talk about this. I don't know how many videos I made on the Ottonians. Probably a congruous amount, because it's always one of those topics that you must address from the actual, like, okay, we must go full dive, several tens of videos that of course we haven't done, but here I see we are in the tens, of course, and how many? Only 14 videos. Oh my god, it's really too few. It's really too few. Well, better than nothing, of course, but half of it is military stuff, and it's too unspecific. That we have to do much more. We have to do really much more. Very well. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.